Search for the Battle of Castle Itter on YouTube and you will find dozens of videos, dramatic narration about one of the strangest battles of the Second World War. Americans and Germans fighting heroically side by side in a medieval Austrian castle against hordes of fanatical SS soldiers making a last stand for the Reich. An extraordinary military confrontation, a defining moment where enemies became allies. Almost none of it is accurate. The actual defending force at Castle Itter on May 5, 1945 was 36 people, 1 operational tank, 14 American soldiers from a reconnaissance unit who happened to be nearby, 10 German artillerymen who had already surrendered to the Americans the previous day and were not really combatants in any meaningful military sense, a handful of resistance fighters including one 17-year-old Austrian, an SS officer who had defected, and a group of French politicians and generals who picked up weapons and defended the walls of their own prison because there was nothing else to do. The SS men who attacked the castle were not the elite fanatical warriors of YouTube legend. They were the exhausted remnants of a division that had been losing continuously since Normandy, that had abandoned all its vehicles 10 weeks before Castle Itter, and had been retreating through Germany and Austria on foot ever since, whose divisional commander had been dead since March. Their own division surrendered to American forces the following day. The men who attacked Castle Itter were following the last order they had been given because nobody had given them a different one. That is not fanaticism. That is the inertia of a war machine that had already stopped, but had not yet found a way to fall over. What actually happened at Castle Itter is smaller, more confused, more human, and more interesting than any dramatized version of the story. The YouTube myth makes it sound like a military epic. The real story is better than that. It is a story of specific people making specific choices in a specific moment of complete institutional collapse, when the structures that normally tell people what to do had stopped functioning and everyone had to decide for themselves what to do next. This is that story. To understand the battle, you have to understand the castle first, and to understand the castle, you have to understand who was inside it. Because the most extraordinary thing about Castle Itter is not the fighting. It is the specific collection of human beings who happened to be imprisoned there, and the specific reasons each of them was there, and what they did when the moment came. Castle Itter sits on a hill approximately 700 meters above sea level in the North Tyrol region of Austria, a few miles south of the town of Würgl. The original structure dates to the 13th century. By the 20th century, it had been converted into a private estate and then a hotel. After the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria in 1938, the castle came under German government control. In 1940, it was rented out to the German authorities. In 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, under the direct orders of Heinrich Himmler, seized the castle from its owner Franz Gruner and converted it into a prison facility. By April 25th, 1943, the conversion was complete, and Castle Itter was administratively attached to the Dachau concentration camp. A staff of Eastern European prisoners detached from Dachau was brought in to do maintenance and menial work. The castle's new function was specific and unusual. It was not a death camp, it was not a labour camp, it was a prison for high-value French prisoners that the Reich considered useful as potential bargaining chips or political leverage. The commander of this facility was Eduard Weiter, who was also the commandant of the main Dachau camp. He administered Castle Itter from a distance, visiting periodically, while a small staff of SS guards maintained day-to-day operations on site. The conditions for the prisoners were, by the standards of German wartime incarceration, comfortable. The French prisoners slept in converted guest rooms. They had access to the castle's substantial library. They took exercise in a courtyard built around a 13th century fountain. Daladier had a clandestine radio in his room on which he listened to BBC broadcasts. Barotra played tennis on a court in the castle grounds. The food was not plentiful, but it was adequate. This was not Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. It was a gilded cage in the Austrian Alps, and the people inside it were among the most prominent French citizens alive. Paul Reynaud was 66 years old and had been Prime Minister of France during the Battle of France in 1940. He was the man who had tried to fight on when the German breakthrough made the military situation catastrophic, who had brought Charles de Gaulle into the government as Under-Secretary of State for National Defence, and who had eventually resigned rather than sign the armistice when his cabinet turned against continued resistance. He had spent the subsequent years in Vichy custody, then German custody, and had been at Castle Itter since 1943. Edouard Daladier was 60 and had been Prime Minister before Reynaud, signing the Munich Agreement in 1938. Reynaud and Daladier hated each other with the specific intensity of men who had been on opposite sides of the most consequential political argument of the decade. They did not eat at the same table in the castle dining room. They moved through the same small space with the careful distance of men who had decided to preserve their mutual contempt rather than allow the circumstances to dissolve it. Along with Reynaud and Daladier were Generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, the two men who had successively commanded the French army during the 1940 disaster, and who blamed each other for it, with the same passionate conviction that Reynaud and Daladier blamed each other for everything else. Weygand had been appointed to replace Gamelin near the end of the Battle of France, had concluded that resistance was futile, recommended an armistice, and then collaborated with the Vichy regime in ways that earned him the contempt of every Frenchman who had continued fighting. Gamelin had been tried by the Vichy government at the Riom trial in 1942 and had refused to answer the charges. He was 72 years old at Castle Itter and had spent 3 years in German custody after Vichy handed him over. Jean Borotra was 47 years old, a former Wimbledon champion and French Open winner, had served as Commissioner of Sport in the Vichy government and been arrested by the Germans in 1942 after refusing to fully collaborate with Nazi sports policy. Léon Jouot was a trade union leader and anti-fascist. François de la Roque was a right-wing politician and leader of the Croix de Feu movement, who had paradoxically been supporting the French resistance. Marie-Agnès Caillot, née de Gaulle, was the elder sister of Charles de Gaulle and had been interned at Castle Itter only in April 1945, just weeks before the battle. Her husband Alfred Caillot, a minor politician, was also there. Reynaud's secretary and future wife Christiane Mabire was imprisoned alongside him. Michel Clemenceau, son of the First World War Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, was there. The aggregate political and military history represented by the people in that castle was the entire French Third Republic. They detested each other across most of their internal divisions. The Weygands ate at one table, the Reynaud faction ate at another. The various neutrals occupied a third. They had been living in close proximity for between 1 and 2 years by May 1945, which is a long time to be locked in a medieval Austrian castle with your political enemies. The one thing they agreed on by May 1945 was that the approaching American forces needed to reach them before whatever happened at the end of the Reich happened to them specifically. Himmler had given no orders about what to do with the Castle Itter prisoners if the Allied advance reached the Tyrol. The absence of orders was itself terrifying. The prisoners had seen what happened to other high-value prisoners when the Reich's institutions collapsed. They had reason to be afraid. The SS division that would ultimately attack the castle had been accumulating a very different kind of history since 1943. The Götz von Berlichingen, as it was formerly named, was formed in October 1943 in Poitiers, France, from a mixture of Germans, Volksdeutsche from Romania and other Eastern European countries, Belgians and French volunteers. The division was not, from the beginning, the elite formation that the Waffen-SS label implies. By June 1944, when it was committed to the Normandy fighting, 2 of its 6 battalions were still on bicycles. It had no tanks, only Sturmgeschütz 4 assault guns, and it was below strength in both officers and soldiers before it had fired a shot in anger. In Normandy, the division found the 82nd Airborne Division waiting for it at Carentan in the first weeks of June 1944. The fighting was brutal and the losses were severe. The division spent most of the summer in continuous combat in the Bocage country near Saint-Lô, using combined arms battle groups to delay the American advance, counterattacking when they could, losing men at a rate that could not be replaced from available resources. By the beginning of July, its strength had been reduced to approximately 8,500 men, already significantly below its nominal establishment. Then came Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead at the end of July 1944. The 2nd US Armoured Division encircled elements of the 17th SS around Roncy. The division lost most of its armoured equipment in the encirclement and only escaped destruction by dispersing. It then took part in the Mortain Offensive, Operation Lüttich, Hitler's attempt to cut the American corridor after the breakout, which failed decisively and produced further catastrophic losses. By late summer 1944, the 17th SS was a formation in name more than in reality. It was rebuilt through the autumn with replacements and new equipment, fought at Metz in October and November, retreated to the Saar, fought in the Nordwind Offensive in January 1945, and defended the Siegfried Line through February and March 1945. By March 18, 1945, it had been rebuilt to approximately 7,000 men with 62 assault guns, of which 47 were operational, and 2 Mark IV tanks. On March 22, 1945, its divisional commander SS Oberfuhrer Fritz Klingenberg was killed in action. That same day, faced with American breakthrough and encirclement, the division abandoned all its vehicles and began to retreat on foot. Only 500 to 600 men escaped the encirclement in the Pfälzer Forest. The 17th SS had lost its vehicles, its commander, and most of its equipment in a single day. It was rebuilt again. By April 1st, 1945, the division's strength had been reconstituted to roughly 7,000 men, a figure that reflects the Reich's increasingly desperate scraping of manpower reserves rather than any real recovery. The 38th SS Regiment was destroyed in the fighting for Nuremberg by April 20th. The remnants of the division retreated southeast toward the Tyrol, following the mythical Alpine Redoubt concept that Himmler and others in the SS leadership were still promoting as a coherent plan at this stage when it was manifestly neither coherent nor a plan. The 17th SS surrendered to American forces near Lake Aachen on May 6, 1945, the day after the battle at Castle Itter. The men who attacked the castle on May 5th were not the main body of the division. They were small elements, stragglers, a local force operating on orders from a command structure that was itself in the process of dissolving. A military historian writing specifically about the 17th SS described the Castle Itter engagement as a grand name for a small operation involving small elements from the division. He was correct. The characters who would bring the battle about were assembling in the Tyrol through April 1945, each one arriving by a different route with a different story. Josef Sepp Gangl was born on September 12, 1910 in Obertraubling near Regensburg and had been a professional soldier since 1928. He was not a political soldier. He was a career artilleryman who had served through the Saar Offensive, the Phoney War, Operation Barbarossa, the Normandy Campaign and the Ardennes Offensive. He had been awarded the German Cross in Gold on March 8, 1945, shortly before the entire structure of the Wehrmacht in which he served began to collapse around him. He was promoted to major and given command of the 2nd Division of Werfer Regiment 83, a Nebelwerfer rocket artillery unit that, by this stage of the war, no longer had any Nebelwerfer equipment. The unit was a formation in name. What Gangl actually commanded was the human remnant of a unit whose function no longer existed. His brigade commander, General Kurt Pape, ordered the remaining commanders of his battalions near Peisenberg to fight their way to Tyrol and take part in the defense of the Alpine fortress. This was the Alpenfestung, the Alpine Redoubt, the last-ditch strategy the SS leadership was promoting and that most professional Wehrmacht officers understood to be a fantasy. Gangl arrived in Wörgl in mid-April 1945, after being assigned by Lieutenant General Georg Ritter von Hengel to the Giel Combat Group under Lieutenant Colonel Johann Giel. His orders were to defend Wörgl against the approaching Americans to the last man and to blow bridges and block roads to delay the advance. Gangl had fought for Germany for 6 years. He had watched the SS conduct itself in ways that had systematically removed whatever ideological commitment he had carried into the war. A few days after his arrival in Wörgl, he contacted the local group of the Austrian resistance under Alois Meyer and began providing them with information and weapons. He had decided that the order to defend Wörgl to the last man was an order he was not going to execute. He wanted to get his men home alive. On May 3, 1945, parts of the Giel Combat Group were attacked by the 12th US Armoured Division and suffered heavy casualties. General Hengel ordered his troops withdrawn from Wörgl and the surrounding area, whereupon units of the Waffen-SS moved in. Gangl and 10 of his men violated the withdrawal order and stayed behind in Wörgl, ostensibly still part of the German military structure, but effectively outside it. He was simultaneously a German major under orders and a member of the Austrian resistance providing those same orders opposition with weapons. That was his situation on the morning of May 4, 1945, when a man arrived on a bicycle. Andreas Krobot was the Czech cook who had been employed at Castle Itter during the imprisonment of the French. He was not a soldier, he was a cook who had spent 2 years inside that castle watching the French prisoners and the German guards and understanding very clearly what the situation was and what it was likely to produce. On the morning of May 4th, he rode his bicycle out of the castle and toward Vögel to find help. He had ridden approximately halfway to Vögel when he was nearly caught by a German patrol. A local Austrian pulled him into a building off the road, and that local Austrian turned out to be connected to Alois Mayer's resistance network. Krobot explained what was happening at the castle. Mayer passed the information to Gangl. Gangl understood immediately that the situation required American forces and that he was the only person in the immediate area who could get American forces. His orders from the German command were to fight the Americans. His actual intention was to go and find them. He drove under a white flag to Kufstein, where he had been informed a unit of the 12th Armoured Division was located. Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr. of the 23rd Tank Battalion was there with his unit. Lee was 23 years old, a tank company commander who was at Kufstein waiting to be relieved by the 36th Infantry Division, and who was not expecting to spend his afternoon talking to a German major who wanted to surrender and then immediately turn around and fight on the American side. Gangl laid out the situation. He told Lee about the castle, the French prisoners, the threat from SS elements in the area, and his own intention to help defend the castle if Lee would provide American forces. Lee radioed for reinforcements and was eventually given a detachment of tanks and infantry from the recently arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. Then, characteristically, he decided not to wait for them. Lee set off with what he had. One Sherman tank, his M4A3E8, named Besotten Jenny, derived from German soldiers' slang for a drunk girl. 14 American soldiers from his unit, Gangl, and 10 of his artillerymen, riding in a truck, men who had formally surrendered to Lee that afternoon and were now driving toward a fight on the American side. On the way to the castle, Lee tried to pick up additional tank support, but the bridge on the route to the castle was too weak to take the weight of additional Shermans. He sent the extra tanks back. What he had was what he had. The route to Castle Itter was not uncontested. Lee's small convoy encountered SS elements attempting to set up a roadblock on the road to the castle and dealt with them before pressing on. They reached the castle on the evening of May 4th. Inside they found the French prisoners armed and organised, having taken weapons left behind by the SS guards who had fled when the situation became clear. And they found Kurt Siegfried Schrader. Schrader was an SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain's rank in the SS hierarchy. He was highly decorated. He had served as a bodyguard in Hitler's personal security detail at the Führerhauptquartier. After being severely wounded in combat in France in 1944, he had been sent to recover from his wounds at Castle Itter, where the relative quiet and the altitude made it a suitable convalescent facility for SS officers. During his recovery, he had spent months in proximity to the French prisoners, men of considerable intelligence and political sophistication, and he had arrived at conclusions that had made whatever he had believed when he served in Hitler's bodyguard impossible to sustain. He had defected, he had thrown in his lot with the local Austrian resistance. When the SS guards fled the castle, he stayed. He offered his services to the French prisoners as the defender of the castle until American forces could arrive. His wife and 2 young daughters were in the cellar of the castle. He was defending them as much as he was defending anyone. The night of May 4th produced one of the strangest scenes of the entire war. Lee, Gangl and Schrader walked the castle's defensive positions together, checking fields of fire, discussing the approaches from the east and the gaps in the perimeter that would need to be covered. An American captain from Ohio, a Wehrmacht major who had been quietly working with the Austrian resistance, and an SS officer who had served in Hitler's personal bodyguard were conducting a military reconnaissance together in a medieval Austrian castle while discussing how best to defend it against the SS division that was going to attack it in the morning. After the inspection, the 3 men had dinner together in the Great Hall. They sat at the same table for hours talking about the war, their respective experiences, where they had been and what they had seen. Schrader's wife and daughters were in the basement, the French prisoners were in their rooms, the watch rotation had been set. Outside in the Austrian hills, somewhere in the darkness, the remnants of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division were moving. What exactly happened to the castle's original SS guards before Lee and Gangl arrived requires a brief account of the preceding days. Eduard Weiter, the Dachau commandant who administered Castle Itter, had been at the castle as the American advance reached the Tyrol. On May 3rd, 1945, he either committed suicide or was killed by the prisoners, depending on which account you accept. The uncertainty about his death reflects the general chaos of those final days. After his death, the SS guards who had been running the castle made the calculation that most German soldiers in similar situations were making across Austrian Germany in the first days of May 1945, which was that the war was over and that being captured by the Allies in the act of guarding French political prisoners was not a good position to be in. They left. They took their weapons with them mostly. They left the French prisoners in the castle with the locked gates and the walls and the food stores and the clandestine radio and the specific, well-founded anxiety that someone might arrive with orders to kill them before the Americans arrived. The prisoners armed themselves with whatever weapons the departing guards had left behind, which was not very much. They organised a watch. They sent Crowbot on his bicycle. By the time Lee and Gangle and the convoy arrived on the evening of May 4th, the castle had been in the hands of its prisoners for approximately 1 day. The situation was clear to everyone inside the walls. There were SS elements in the surrounding area. Those elements had specific motivations for preventing the castle from falling into American hands, with its French prisoners alive and available to testify about their treatments. The night watch was taken seriously by everyone who had understood the situation, which by that point was everyone. At approximately 4 o'clock on the morning of May 5th, 1945, heavy gunfire broke out around the castle. A German MG-42 opened up from a ridgeline to the east of the castle, its distinctive high rate of fire audible at considerable distance. An American corporal named William Sutton, who was manning one of the tower positions, spotted soldiers approaching the western wall with grappling hooks, apparently intending to scale it. Lee was woken immediately. The battle began in confusion and remained in confusion throughout, which is what actual combat looks like when the forces involved are improvised. The command relationships have been assembled in the previous few hours, and the attackers are not operating with any particular tactical sophistication. The defending force took its positions. The German artillerymen, Gangle's men, were not infantry. They were men who operated Nebelwerfer rocket artillery, a completely different military function, and who found themselves now defending castle walls with rifles. They did this. Schrader and his people held the upper floors, firing down at the SS men below. The Americans held the gatehouse. Lee's Sherman, besotten Jenny, was positioned to cover the main approach, its 76mm gun and hull machine gun providing the most significant firepower the defenders had. The French prisoners were instructed to take shelter in the keep. Several of them declined to do so. Reynaud and Daladier and others picked up weapons and positioned themselves on the walls. These were men in their 60s who had spent 2 years as prisoners in an Austrian castle and who were now shooting at the SS soldiers trying to get in. Borotra played tennis in the castle grounds. He would shortly do something considerably more useful. The SS attacking force of 100 to 150 men could not take the castle with small arms fire alone. After some hours of fighting, they brought up an 88mm anti-tank gun. The 88mm was the most feared German artillery weapon of the entire war, a high-velocity gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges that Allied tank guns could not match. When they fired it at Besotten, Jenny they hit it. Lee's Sherman was destroyed. The most significant fighting platform the defenders had was gone. The position was becoming untenable. Lee's small American force was the only element of the defending group with any real combat experience and training. The German artillerymen were doing what they could with weapons they had not trained on in roles they had not been trained for. The former prisoners shooting from the walls were improvising entirely. At some point during the late morning, with ammunition running low, Lee made a calculation. He needed reinforcements. He had already radioed for them. The 142nd Infantry Regiment had received the call and a relief force had been dispatched, but it had not yet arrived. Without the reinforcements, the castle was going to fall. Jean Borotra, 47 years old, tennis champion, Vichy official, prisoner and amateur marksman, asked to be allowed to go for help. Lee agreed. Borotra borrowed a uniform. He climbed the castle wall, dropped to the other side, and ran. He ran through SS-held ground between the castle and the American relief force. He ran until he reached the approaching 142nd Infantry Unit, got their attention, communicated what was happening in what English he had, and turned around and came back with them. The specific mechanics of how he navigated through the SS elements between the castle and the relief force are not fully documented, which is itself a reflection of the fact that nobody who was there later understood exactly how he managed it either. The relief force arrived and the battle ended. The SS men who had been attacking the castle, faced with American infantry and armour rather than the improvised garrison they had been fighting, quickly dispersed into the woods and were pursued. Approximately 100 SS soldiers were captured. The remaining attackers scattered into the Austrian hills, where the war caught up with them over the following days. There was one casualty on the defending side. Major Josef Sepp Gangl, who had been a German soldier for 17 years and who had died doing what he had decided to do with the last weeks of that service, was killed by a sniper at some point during the morning. The specific circumstances are documented with the imprecision that accompanies most deaths in combat, but the direction of his movement at the moment he was shot is consistent. He was killed while positioning himself between a sniper's line of fire and Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister who had been his country's enemy in 1940 and whose life he had just given his own to protect. He was 34 years old. He is buried in the Forest Cemetery in Wörgl. There is a street named after him there. Schrader survived the battle. His wife and daughters in the cellar were unharmed. What became of him in the months and years after May 5th, 1945 is not well documented. He had served in Hitler's personal bodyguard detail, which was not a background that simplified post-war life in Germany or Austria. The specific path he took from the castle to whatever the rest of his life looked like is not in the public record with any detail. Lee survived the battle and the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his role in the Castle Itter action. He continued his military career and eventually retired from the US Army. He died in 2001. The French prisoners were evacuated immediately after the battle and all survived. Reynaud returned to French politics and served in various governmental roles in the post-war decades. Daladier also returned to politics. Weygand, whose collaboration with Vichy remained controversial for the rest of his life, was eventually cleared of the most serious charges against him and died in 1965 at the age of 98. Gamelin lived a life of solitude after the war and died in 1958. Borotra continued to play tennis competitively until well into his 80s and died in 1994. Marie-Agnès Caillot, who had been interned in the castle only weeks before its liberation, returned to France and to her brother. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division formally surrendered to American forces near Lake Aachen on May 6, 1945, the day after the battle. The men who had attacked the castle had done so as part of a division that laid down its weapons 24 hours later. They were the end of something rather than the middle of it. The fanatical last stand of YouTube imagination was this: men following old orders issued by a command structure that had already decided to surrender, attacking a position they could not take, in a war that was 3 days from formal conclusion. The battle is genuinely strange, not because of the alliance it produced, which was less an alliance than a pragmatic convergence of people who all needed the same thing to happen. It is strange because of the specific cast of characters who found themselves in that castle in those days. The two former prime ministers who had spent 2 years refusing to speak to each other, picking up weapons and shooting from the walls. The tennis champion jumping off the castle and running through enemy fire to find the relief column. The SS officer whose family was in the basement defending the people he had once been their jailer's subordinate in imprisoning. The German major who had won the German Cross in gold 2 months before he died, protecting a man who had been his country's enemy. The 23-year-old American tank captain who heard a German major's surrender and immediately agreed to fight alongside him without particularly needing to think about it. The story does not require embellishments. The embellishment is the problem. When you tell it as an epic military confrontation, you lose what actually makes it worth telling, which is the specific human beings and the specific choices they made when the institutions that normally made their choices for them had dissolved. That is the Castle Itter story. Not a great battle, a specific moment when a few dozen people decided what they were going to do, when the world around them stopped telling them. What happened to the town of Wörgl in those same days deserves a mention because it shows the broader context in which the Castle Itter action occurred. Wörgl had been the site of one of the most remarkable economic experiments of the 1930s, the so-called Miracle of Wörgl, when the local mayor had implemented an alternative currency scheme during the Depression that had dramatically reduced unemployment before the Austrian national government shut it down. By May 1945, Wörgl was simply a small Austrian town trying to survive the end of a war it had not wanted. The local Austrian resistance, Gangel's contact Alois Meyer and his people had spent weeks trying to prevent the Wehrmacht and SS units passing through from destroying the town's bridges and infrastructure in a futile attempt to delay the American advance. Every bridge destroyed was an impediment to the post-war recovery of a town that had done nothing to deserve the consequences of military decisions made by people who would not be living there afterward. Gangel had promised his men they would survive the war. He had not promised himself the same thing. The 10 artillerymen who had surrendered to Lee with Gangel and who had ridden in the truck to Castle Itter all survived. They were taken into American custody after the battle and processed as prisoners of war. Gangel was buried with military honours by the Austrian resistance. His grave in the forest cemetery in Würgl has been maintained ever since. The street named after him, Sepp-Gangl-Straße, is one of the few streets in Austria named after a man who spent most of the war on the German side. The confusion that surrounds the battle, even in serious historical accounts, reflects the confusion of those days. Who gave the order for the 17th SS elements to attack Castle Itter is not clearly established. The divisional command structure by May 5th was in the process of dissolving. The SS units in the Tyrol were operating with varying degrees of connection to any coherent chain of command. The specific officer who decided that retaking the castle from the Americans who had arrived the previous day was a worthwhile use of his remaining men and equipment is not identified in any account. It may have been a local decision made by an SS officer who still had men who would follow orders, and who had not yet received the order to surrender that was coming the following day. The men who attacked the castle may not have known that their division was surrendering 24 hours later. They may have known and decided it did not change their immediate situation. The record does not say. This is the thing that the YouTube version of the battle consistently fails to capture. By May 5th, 1945, in the Austrian Tyrol, nobody had a clear picture of what was happening. The German command structure had fractured. Units were receiving contradictory orders from multiple sources. Some commanders were following orders to fight, some were following the order that Gangel had implicitly followed, which was the human decision to stop. Some were waiting to see which way things went before deciding. The battle at Castle Itter happened in the middle of this, a small violent episode in a landscape of institutional collapse, fought by men on both sides who were improvising responses to a situation that no military doctrine had prepared them for. The prisoners who were liberated from Castle Itter on May 5, 1945 carried with them something that would shape French post-war politics for decades. Reynaud and Daladier returned to France and resumed their careers, bringing with them the specific experience of having been imprisoned by the Germans and then defended by a German major who died to protect them. The argument about what the French leadership had and had not done in 1940 continued long after the war. Reagan spent years defending his decision to recommend the armistice. Gemelin never discussed the Riem trial or its aftermath publicly. The specific human cost of the French defeat of 1940, which had placed all these people in a castle in Austria for 2 years, was not resolved by the liberation. It was simply relocated from the inside of the prison to the outside of it. The castle still stands. It is a private residence today, not open to the public. The hill above Würgl, the 13th century fountain in the courtyard where the French prisoners had taken their daily exercise, the great hall where Lee and Gangel and Schrader had their dinner the night before the battle, all of it is still there. The marks of the fighting on May 5th are long gone. And that brings today's video to an end. Thank you so much for watching, and especially if you've made it this far. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow and allows me to continue creating these videos, so I hope you'll join me again for the next one. Until then, thank you for watching and goodbye for now.